everyone. Welcome to the Greece New Lecture. For those of you who I haven't met, my name is Elizabeth King. I'm the director of the Center for Russian East European and Eurasian Studies. I'm also an associate professor in the Department of Health Behavior and Health Equity at the School of Public Health. Very excited to, for all of you to get to hear this lecture, Women's Forgotten Revolution, Communism, and the Struggle for Emancipation in Post-War Poland, by Dr. Agnieszka Mrozik, who's a CCPS Dianne Widzinski visiting fellow and associate professor of the research for the Polish Academy of Sciences. Before we move into today's talk, I just want to draw your attention to a couple of upcoming events. Greece is happy to co-sponsor the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia film screening of Bucha, which will show at Michigan Theater on Wednesday, April 23rd from 5 to 7 p.m. And then also Greece has the ongoing exhibition Threading the Needle, Vestiges of Colonialism and Femininity, an installation by Bucha, which is right next door. So after the talk, you're welcome to see it if you haven't, or come anytime before May 2nd or May 4th?
I think May
4th. my paper tells me May 2nd, but the slide says May 4th. So you may be able to sneak in that weekend. Oh, okay, yes. So May 2nd.
It's on Friday.
All right. So, back to today's lecture, we're happy to have this co-sponsored by the Copernicus Center for Polish Studies, the Institute for Research on Women and Gender, and Slavic Languages and Literatures. So today's speaker, Agnieszka Mrozik, is currently a senior Dianne Widzinski visiting fellow at the Copernicus Center for Polish Studies here at the University of Michigan. She's also an associate professor of literary studies at the Institute of Literary Research of the Polish Academy of Sciences. Agnieszka is affiliated with two research units, the Center for Cultural and Literal Studies of Communism and the Women's Archive. She was also a fellow of the Emre Kertész Szkola in Vienna, the Institute for Advanced Study at CEU, and the DAAD program at the University of Hamburg. She was also recently a guest professor at the European University Viadrina in Frankfurt. Dr. Mrozik is the author of Female Architects of the Polish People's Republic, Communist Women, Literature, and Women's Emancipation in Post-War Poland, and Midwives of the Transformation, Women, Literature, and Power in Post-1989 Poland. She has also co-authored and co-edited several collected volumes, including Reassessing Communism, Concepts, Culture, and Society in Poland, 1944 to 1989, which was recently published by CEU Press. Before I turn it over to Dr. Mrozik for her lecture, I just first let Wanda Żółkiewska, the director of the Copernicus Center for Polish Studies, say a couple words about the fellowship.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Welcome, everyone. This is our last event, last Copernicus event of the year, so we're very excited that you're here to welcome Agnieszka Mrozik. And I want to tell you a few words about this special opportunity that's made available to us thanks to Dianne Widzinski, who's here, and for we're extremely grateful for your support in providing funding to bring Polish scholars, senior and junior, to Ann Arbor for several weeks up to a semester. So in addition to Agnieszka, this semester we have two graduate students, PhD candidates, who are hiding in the back. We have Paweł Bagiński, and is Emilia here today? I don't see Emilia. And another also graduate student. They're here to do their research and meet people. So I think that a lot of you already have met Agnieszka. Lots of collaborations in the work. So we're very happy to have them with us and to have this exceptional opportunity thanks to the Widzinski Fellowship. I want to announce in advance that we have two more senior fellows coming next fall. Now that I have my glasses, I can. So we have Elżbieta who's an associate professor of education at the University of Warsaw, and who focuses on film and history, memory in film, and contemporary Polish historical cinema. And Magdalena Drodowska, who's assistant professor at the Institute of Audiovisual Arts of Jagiellonian University in Krakow, and she is working on a research project entitled The Deaf History of Cinema, analyzing the complex mutual relations between deafness and cinema as a form of art and as a technology. So two people actually also, they know each other but haven't worked together, so they were very happy to be selected as two fellows, and I think they will also collaborate with the Polish Film Festival organized by the Polish Cultural Fund. So thank you, Dianne. Welcome, Agnieszka. We look forward to your lecture, and we look forward to hosting more Widzinski Fellows in the future.
Okay. Thank you. Will you turn on the presentation? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. So before I begin my talk, I would like to sincerely thank, first of all, Dianne Widzinski, whose generous gift allowed me to come to the States and do my research here and network and collaborate with researchers working here. I also would like to thank Professor Genevieve Zubrzycki, who invited me to the Copernicus Center for Polish Studies, and also the staff members, particularly Gosia Kowalczyk and Brigitta Kochler, who made my stay here comfortable and, you know, allowed me to do the productive research, I would say. I also would like to thank Elizabeth King, who invited me to give this talk as part of the CREAS noon lectures, and Liz Malinkin, who made all this happen in terms of organization. So, in today's talk, in today's lecture, I would like to discuss the activities of women, Polish women, who designed and implemented emancipation policies in Poland and around the world after the end of the Second World War. My aim is to analyze how leftist protagonists of that period, Polish socialist and communist women politicians, intellectuals, and activists of women's organizations, found their way in the post-war reality and shaped and implemented the program of women's emancipation as one of the pillars of socialist modernization. I would like to begin with the observation that while historians in Poland, especially women historians, have done a lot to study and popularize the history of Polish women and women's movement at the turn of the 20th century and in the interwar period, when it comes to examining what happened after the Second World War, it turns out that the situation of women, especially women's organizations and activists in that period, is either overlooked or schematized. The so-called mainstream Polish historiography on state socialism is either silent about women's participation in shaping the post-war reality, including the improvement of women's living conditions in Poland. On the other hand, on the one hand, this is due to an anti-communist rationale that denies any modernizing dimension of the Polish People's Republic. On the other hand, the gender blindness of many historians prevents the recognition and appreciation of women who participated in the reconstruction of the country after the war, and especially leftist women politicians, thinkers, and activists of women's organizations who did much in the fields of education, science, culture, and women's and children's rights. Post-transition, namely post-1989, feminist historiography in turn has until recently portrayed the post-war socialist period as a time of so-called apparent equality. The great educational and professional advancement of Polish women was rarely mentioned, and when it was with a series of reservations. It was presented as incomplete and above all unfinished. Also silenced were the activities of women politicians, intellectuals, and activists who worked to design and implement the program of socialist modernization, democratization of social relations, and women's emancipation. It was usually emphasized that post-war, post-Second World War, women activists, socialists, and communists were dependent on the party in their actions and only followed its directives, which is why their achievements were called top-down emancipation and treated with reserve. when attempts were made to recognize their efforts, it was pointed out that what they did after 1945 was merely a continuation of interwar activities. From this point of view, the People's Republic of Poland had no merit for women's empowerment and functioned as a gap between what existed before the Second World War and what came after 1989. However, I would like to emphasize that in the field of feminist historiography, as well as in other areas of feminist research, changes in thinking about social and cultural processes in post-war Poland are already visible on the horizon. In the last 15 years, a number of works have appeared that attempt to look at the post-war period from a different, not strictly political black and white perspective. And I'm referring here to the historical publications by Małgorzata Fidelis and also Natalia Jarska. The title in English would be Women from Marble, Women Workers in Poland between 1945 and 1960. So these two works comprehensively discuss state socialist Poland's policy toward women in the labor market, identifying emancipatory but also traditionalist solutions in this regard, and they focus primarily on the first 15 years after the war. But there is also a quite recent book by 4 historians, Katarzyna Stańczak-Wiślicz, Piotr Perkowski, Małgorzata Fidelis, and Barbara Klich-Kluczewska. And the English title would be Women in Poland, 1945-1989, Modernity, Equality, Communism. This book will be also published in English. I think it's expected this year. So this book, this last book, goes beyond the Stalinist period and examines the intersection of emancipatory and traditionalist solutions in the gender politics of state socialist Poland in various areas of social life, the family, sexual relations, attitude towards the body. But there are also other works that attempt to look at state socialist Poland and its emancipation policies from a perspective of other disciplines. And this include work by Agnieszka Kościańska, who is anthropologist, and in this book she examines the development of sexological discourse in Poland in the 1970s and 1980s. There is also a book by film scholar Monika Tolarczyk-Gubała, who analyzes the activities of the socialist realist filmmaker Wanda Jakubowska with new tools and from a new perspective. And finally, the changes arrived in the field of literary studies, that is my field. The new publications appeared that attempt to go beyond the usual, often schematic interpretations of women's diverse literary production after 1945. And here is my book so far in Polish, The Female Architects of the Polish People's Republic, Communist Women Literature and Women's Emancipation in Post-War Poland, and its English version is already in preparation. So in this book I examine the commitment of communist women writers to the processes of emancipation after the war. But there is also a book by another literary scholar, Katarzyna Szopa. In English the title is An Explosion of the Imagination, Anna Świerczyńska's Poetry and the Reproduction of Social Life, which offers a new reading of Anna Świerczyńska's poetry through the lens of materialist feminism. And finally, there is a very important book for my research by sociologist Magdalena Grabowska, and the English title is Broken Genealogy, Women's Socio-Political Activity After 1945 and Contemporary Women's Movement. It tells the story of women politicians and activists who created and implemented emancipatory solutions, working in organizations such as the Women's League. It was the biggest, the mass women's organization in post-war Poland, but they also worked in party units such as the Women's Department of the Polish United Workers' Party. And Grabowska, in her research, in her book, argues that professional women politicians and activists proposed projects to improve the situation of women in the labor market. They gave opinions on political projects and lobbied for them. And among those women whom she describes in her book, we can find Edwarda Orłowska, who was in the late 40s, early 50s, the chairwoman of the Women's Department, first of the Polish Workers' Party, then of the Polish United Workers' Party. We have Eugenia Pragierowa, a socialist before the war in the Polish Socialist Party, but after 1948 in the Polish United Workers' Party. In the late 40s, she was Deputy Minister of Labor and Social Welfare. And finally, there is this lady, Irena Stachelska, who just after the war was a chairwoman of the Women's League. So my research begins where Grabowska's research ends. That is, I expand the view of women's activism after the war to include those protagonists who were active in the intersection of several fields. So not only women's rights, but also education, science, and culture. Many of my protagonists, and this was an interesting discovery, so for many of them, women's activism was not in the foreground, and not all of them were active in the field, in this field before the war. But for most of them, women's emancipation was part of the socialist modernization program that they tried to pursue in various fields. So in this talk, I will focus on the activism of my protagonists in three areas: their efforts to promote women's education, and work in Poland, and also their commitment to women's cause internationally. In doing so, I will show that an important tool in shaping and implementing change was culture, like literature, art, film, television, in which protagonists of my research were incredibly active. So as for the educational reform project, known immediately after the war as the third reform, so it was after the agrarian reform and the nationalization of the industry, several names are worth mentioning. And here we have Marxist historian Żanna Kormanowa, director of the Department of Educational Reform in the Ministry of Education from 1945 to 1948, who was responsible for reshaping the role of school in socialist Poland, reviewing curricula and textbooks. We have pre-war teacher Zofia Dembińska, Deputy Minister of Education from 1951 to 1960, responsible for popularizing reading among children and youth, as well as cooperation between schools, parents, and youth organizations in this regard. And finally, we have Eugenia Krassowska, who before the war was a PhD student in literary studies, but after the war chose politics. And she served as Deputy Minister from 1946 to 1965, first in the Ministry of Education, then in the Ministry of Higher Education, and she was responsible for adapting higher education to the demands of the expectations of the socialist state. The research shows that access to free public education for children and youth, as well as for adults, was one of the priorities of the communist government during its first terms. Sociologists, and this is a great book, I'm happy that it was published in English as well, as you can see, by sociologist Agata Zysiak, Limiting Privilege, Upward Mobility Within Higher Education in Socialist Poland. So in this book, she shows how these postulates of providing access to free public educations were implemented in Łódź, where young people from popular classes, namely working class and peasantry, were enrolled in the university founded in 1945. And just wanted to show you, only in 1945, apart from Łódź, there were also universities founded in Toruń. So here we have Łódź, Toruń, and Lublin. But there were also new teacher training colleges established, which led to dynamic increase in the number of students enrolled in higher education. So only in 1945, compared to the interwar period, the number almost doubled. Also, the spending on education rose from 0.5% of the annual state budget in 1939 to 11%. And we are speaking about the country that was largely destroyed by the war. So the protagonists of my research are women who helped shape the post-war educational reform project. Although today they do not evoke positive associations, in this talk I would like to highlight their efforts to facilitate access to public education for children, youth, and adults from different social classes. These efforts were aimed at eradicating illiteracy and also at overcoming class, ethnic, and gender divisions in access to education. And I want to emphasize that my protagonists of my research, but not only them, they were highly involved in debates that took place in the interwar period, because of course all this did not start just after the end of the Second World War. There were heated debates about how the education system should look like in Poland already in the interwar period, and the women I discuss here were highly involved in these debates. Interestingly and importantly, the politicians I mentioned, Kormanowa, Dembińska, and Krassowska, were teachers and educational methodologists by profession, and they were very well prepared to work on the organization of the educational system. When discussing the post-war educational reform, it should be remembered that after the Second World War, about 15 to 18% of the Polish society were people who could not read and write or had problems with it. Therefore, it is not surprising that the demand for universal access to education was, as I said, one of the priorities of the new government. And just very briefly, one of the ways to eradicate illiteracy was to introduce in 1949 a mandatory 7-year elementary school. And this was important, and the discussion about it took place already in the interwar period. However, that time these attempts to establish the 7-year primary school failed, and that's important because many children, especially in rural areas, finished their education much earlier, even after 4 years of schooling. I mean, what happened before the war, but after the war they established this mandatory elementary, 7-year elementary school. Another attempt that was made was the state campaign against illiteracy, which was conducted in 1949-1952, which included mandatory literacy training for 1 million of an approximately 1.5 million illiterate people aged 14-50. And this was, of course, linked to the mass popularization of reading and access to culture among children, youth, and adults. And that what's important is that not only schools and parents were involved, and not the state were involved in this campaign, but also youth organizations, women's organizations, trade unions, and factories. And a key role in this campaign was played by women teachers, librarians, entertainers, educators, and economy and community center workers. These were all feminized professions, but they were clearly valued in the new political order, both in terms of income and social prestige. With regard to the education of girls, young women, the need to educate them in vocational and technical schools and in engineering studies was emphasized. So the education system was to be coordinated with the labor market or with the workforce in order to produce skilled workers in all industries without distinguishing between male and female professions. So as early as 1946, so just a year after the war ended, women were admitted to courses and training to prepare them for jobs in professions previously reserved for men, such as miners, steel workers, welders, and engineers. The women's magazines published by the Women's League, so this organization, they wrote regularly about this, emphasizing that the war-destroyed country desperately needed professionals, experts in all fields, and that women were just as good as men. So at the same time, as part of the struggle to break down class, ethnic, and gender barriers, high schools and universities were open to girls and boys from all classes and ethnic groups. So at the end of the first post-war decade, Polish public schooling became free, public, secular, and coeducational. However, interestingly, this last aspect, namely coeducation, rose some controversies. Sadly, this project began to crack in the late 1960s and early 70s, when voices were raised that too many women were studying technical fields, that they were taking places away from men in universities. And even earlier, in the mid-50s, girls were more likely to choose the humanities and boys the sciences, thus reproducing the gender division of secondary and higher education. Moreover, after the first few years of intensive encouragement to pursue secondary and tertiary education, rural youth dropped out of the education system more quickly and completed only a vocational school. And I think we cannot ignore this fact. We have to keep in mind this conservative message and the continued reproduction of traditional gender and class divisions in education. However, this does not change the fact that after the war, Polish women were given unprecedented opportunities for education, but also for academic careers, including leadership positions in education. And in 1953, Eugenia Krassowska, if you remember, she was this deputy minister for higher education. She wrote in the pages of Nasza Praca, Our Work, the magazine of Women's League, that the number of women professors and lecturers in all disciplines increased from 74 in one of the last years before the war to 454 in 1951/52, and the number of women university assistants rose from 275 to 2,973. This year continued in the years that followed. However, I would say not that quickly as the post-war modernizers of higher education might have wished. So at the beginning of 70s, the number of women professors counted 8.6%. A decade later, so at the beginning of the 80s, 11.2%, and at the end of 80s, 13.2%. Nevertheless, and I want to emphasize this, the excellent education of women in Poland is one of the legacies of the communist era. We may not like it, but these are the fact. But my protagonists were not only in charge of ministries and departments responsible for education. They also ran publishing houses, magazine editorial offices, and libraries, so they were everywhere where the laws were not only made but also implemented. And in my work, I refer to the excellent, in my opinion, essay by German historian and historiography theorist Reinhard Koselleck. So in this essay, The Limits of Emancipation and Conceptual Historical Sketch, he describes, he explains the history of the concept of emancipation, emphasizing 3 points. And here you have these quotes taken from the English edition of his work. So first, legal emancipation is a necessary but never a sufficient condition of effective equal rights. Second, the legal principle of equal rights for all human beings around the world is proclaimed not only as a legal norm by practice, but practiced as a politically necessary and conscientiously enforced principle of justice for securing our very survival. And finally, no emancipation can merely place individuals on an equal footing. It must always include the interhuman relationships within which people actually live. Therefore, how to explain this? I would say that it's not enough to enact appropriate laws, but they also must be implemented, disseminated, and understood by the society, including women. And I just want to say that in my work I refer to Reinhard Koselleck. However, his explanation of how emancipatory politics work was also explained by Lenin and by Leon Trotsky, who already pointed this out in the aftermath of the October Revolution. So there is this famous quote from Lenin: "Laws alone, of course, are not enough, and we are by no means content with decrees. We tell ourselves, however, this is only the beginning." And here is the quote from Trotsky: to institute the political equality of men and women in the Soviet state was one problem and the simplest, but to achieve the actual equality of men and women within the family is an infinitely more arduous problem. So just want to keep in mind that the contemporary current researchers are also referring to this historical figures. So let me give examples how all this, namely this implementation of the law and making them understandable, was done in Poland after the war. So some of the most important laws from the point of view of women and children enacted in Poland immediately after the war, namely just late 1945, early 1946, were concerned with the introduction of civil marriage, the possibility of obtaining divorce, and the equalization of the rights of children born to married and unmarried couples, including the establishment of alimony obligations. And for many years, women's magazines, such as Kobieta, a woman, which was edited by the writer Janina Broniewska, or another magazine, Przyjaciółka, Girlfriend, the most widely read women's weekly after the war, edited first by Anna Lanota and then by Halina Koszutska. So these magazines not only informed women about their rights, but they also shaped public opinion about the status of unmarried women, who were also mothers. They did a lot to fight the stigmatization of single mothers, and in doing so, they exposed themselves to harsh criticism from the Catholic clergy. We have to always keep in mind that Poland is still, but that time was a Catholic rural society. So the Catholic clergy was particularly strong in rural areas and considered leftist women to be particularly dangerous to social order and morality. And now I would like to move to another area of where my protagonists were particularly active. Namely, it was the position of women in the labor market. So the post-war period, especially the Stalinist period with its 6-year plan, it was implemented between 1950 and 1955, opened up access for women to so-called male professions, which women's magazines, journalists began to call new professions, thus degendering the field of professional work. Many women intellectuals, activists, and politicians fought for women to be able to work as miners, crane operators, and steel workers, well-paying and prestigious jobs at that time. And we have to keep that in mind when we speak about the professions in the post-war Poland. But of course, not only these professions, because Poland, which was rebuilding from the devastation of the war and undergoing hasty industrialization, also needed people to work in healthcare, education, and administration. The phrases that appeared in the debate about the need to increase women's participation in the workforce sounded extremely emancipatory. For example, as early as 1946, the writer Wanda Żółkiewska, in a pamphlet entitled The End of the Kingdom of Saucepans, encouraged her female readers to enter the labor market more actively. And here you have a quote: "For in addition to the tradition of copper pots, the tradition of bitter-bored female slaves, thoughtless or tragic, there are known the traditions of great women, scholars, fighters for freedom and justice, writers, painters, creators of life and culture." Another writer, Janina Dziarnowska, wrote in 1952, "Men's work, women's work. That's what people repeated over and over again. That's what they were taught. A woman was too weak to stand at a machine, with iron, with steel. But she was not too weak to stand at a wash tube for 15 hours. She could also carry sacks of flour and potatoes in the country, half bent, with a sickle, with a hoe, in the heat, but not at the machine. Who came up with such a thing?" On the other hand, in the children's book, The Pioneers, first published in Moscow in 1924 and later republished in 1951, Helena Bobińska proclaimed a message that, in my opinion, that the intellectual mother of second-wave feminism, the French intellectual Simone de Beauvoir, would not be ashamed of. So here you have a quote from this book for children. "It's well known that dinner is best when girls are in the kitchen, because somehow the porridge never burns and the soup never gets too salty. But boys argue that cooking is a woman's thing and that they were born knowing how to do it. Which is not true, of course, because a newborn girl is just as incapable of cooking as a newborn boy." So in her famous work, The Second Sex, which was first published in French in 1949, in English in 1953, the French philosopher Simone de Beauvoir wrote that no one is born, but rather becomes a woman. So in my opinion, de Beauvoir and Bobińska came from the same Marxist tradition, but the Polish writer articulated her thoughts a bit earlier. As in other socialist countries, for example, in Maoist China, which was extensively studied by historian Wang Cheng. By the way, she's a professor emerita who worked here at the University of Michigan. So in her work, she explained on the example of China under Mao that film was a tool for promoting new values, new lifestyles, and new professions. In Poland, the same. Let's take, for example, the classic 1954 socialist realist film The Bus Leaves at 6:20 a.m., based on a screenplay by Wilhelmina Skulska and Jan Rybkowski. Its protagonist was a hairdresser who moved from a small town in Silesia, where she took a job as a welder, gained an education and respect of her community, and finally reconciled with her husband. This was the model. This was the model of modern womanhood at the time. And even if that model did not survive, even if it changed, it was an inspiration for many women. And we know that it was, and other posters from the socialist realist style were role models for women, especially from the working class. So we know that, quoting, for example, I'm reading, for example, the memoirs of Anna Walentyńowicz. I'm sure you all know or heard about this woman. She's the famous Gdańsk shipyard, or she was the famous Gdańsk shipyard crane operator, whose dismissal in the summer of 1980 led to mass protests and the founding of the Solidarity movement in Poland. But before Walentyńowicz became anti-communist opposition activist, she was also involved in this process of state socialist modernization and emancipation of women. And in her memoirs, she said, "I remember such an image, a very popular poster, a girl with a hammer and a saw, smiling and determined, a real worker who, together with other workers, was building a new, better world. This poster made an immediate impression on me, and I began to imagine that it was me." It's worth mentioning that Wilhelmina Skulska, this lady here, was a journalist and scriptwriter of popular productions not only during Stalinism, but also later. In 1970, together with Jan Laskowski, she wrote the script for the 7-part TV series, Dr. Eva, Dr. Eve. The series, broadcast on public television, told the story of a young doctor who moved from Warsaw, the capital of Poland, to a small town where she treated patients, spread medical knowledge, and became an advocate for the modernization of the Polish countryside. The main character became the embodiment of Polish socialist womanhood, pretty, well-educated, dedicated to her work, but not giving up her private life, relationships with men, and love. As such, she became one of the heroines of the mass imagination in late socialist Poland. It should be noted, however, that both this and Skulska's earlier film project stick to the heterosexual convention, but a different approach to the themes of work, family, and women's emancipation was hardly possible in the political and media reality of the time. Skulska's example is not the only one. Around the time of the thaw, so de-Stalinization, many female culture activists, writers, journalists, and translators who have been active during the Stalinist period did not abandon their work for modernization and emancipation, but continued it under changed political conditions. And we can mention here the example of Elżbieta Jackiewiczowa. So she's another pre-war teacher who after the war worked in the Ministry of Education. She also translated Anton Makarenko's A Book for Parents. But her educational and literary career took off in the mid-50s with widely read novels for girls. She was extremely popular as a writer of novels for girls. But she also produced sex guides for young people, and she also collaborated with youth magazines, but also television. In the mid-60s, she worked as an educational consultant for the popular comedy series Wojna domowa, Civil War. Another example is Zofia Bystrzycka, a post-war author of socialist realist short stories, who joined the Women's League magazine, Zwierciadło, The Mirror, in 1957, where she wrote a very popular column, Heart in Dilemma, answering readers' letters. Her novels for women from the 60s, 70s, but also 80s addressed boldly such issues as domestic violence, marital rape, unwanted pregnancy, and women's right to sexual pleasure, anticipating the message of Western feminism and refusing, in my opinion, to confirm contemporary claims that the Polish People's Republic was puritanical and insensitive to women's problems. And I would like to move slowly to the last part of my talk, namely the activism of Polish socialist and communist women in the international arena. And just briefly, for those who are interested, I recently finished a chapter about this activism of Polish women in the international arena. It's called Locally and Globally, Polish Communist Women Activists and Post-War Transnational Emancipation Efforts and How to Write About Them Today. And it was published in this volume. So, in the view of my protagonists, and this was kind of a reason why they also were involved in the international arena, was that the reconstruction of the war-destroyed homeland, war-destroyed Poland, had to go hand in hand with the reconstruction of the world order, or rather with the construction of an entirely new order that they wanted to co-create. Thus, from the end of the war onward, they were part of a broad socialist feminist front. This front is taken from the vocabulary of the era, whose actions stood out in international institutions and organizations. So my protagonists were particularly active in the Women's International Democratic Federation. I'm not sure if you heard about this organization. This was the biggest post-war women's organization, founded in Warsaw, founded in Paris in 1945. So this organization carried on its banners four main slogans: the struggle for women's rights, the struggle for children's rights, the struggle against fascism, and the struggle for peace. Polish women were particularly active in this organization in the first period of its history. They participated in this founding congress in Paris at the end of 1945. They were represented in the executive committee and the council, and they also chaired the Information and Propaganda Commission. They were very active at the women's congresses in Budapest and in Copenhagen, where this lady whom you already saw, the Deputy Minister of Labor and Welfare, Eugenia Krassowska, was elected one of the vice presidents of the WIDF. In the following years, however, Polish women continued their international activities. For example, already mentioned Eugenia Krassowska, the aforementioned Deputy Minister of Science and Higher Education. She represented Poland in the UNESCO, United Nations Educational, Scientific and Culture Organization, from the late 60s to the early 80s, and she was chairwoman of the Polish National Commission for UNESCO and a member of the UNESCO Executive Board. As part of her work for the organization, she insisted that women and girls be guaranteed the right to education and access to culture, stressing that these were fundamental human rights. In 1974, she called on UNESCO to play a more active role in the celebration of the International Women's Year, which was celebrated a year later, namely 1975. In discussing UNESCO's role in the post-war world, Krassowska emphasized the political nature of its activities. In her view, access to education and culture, the fight against illiteracy, were political issues, since their implementation depended on the political condition in individual countries and regions. Therefore, in her public statements, she did not want to separate the discussion of the right to public and free education from the discussion of apartheid in South Africa or the situation of the Palestinians in as she put it, Israeli occupied territories. There is also, it's also important to mention the activities of Polish women in the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, but also the World Peace Council. Polish women were particularly active in the Commission on the Status of Women from the very beginning. Poland's longest representative in the Commission was, as we heard, as I said before, the Zofia Dembińska, the Deputy Minister of Education in Poland. She served on the Commission on the Status of Women in 1951, but then continuously from 1954 to 1968. She was one of the longest serving, not only Polish, but in general women serving in this commission. She chaired the commission in 1962, but then from 1963 to 1967, she participated in the drafting of the Declaration on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which was adopted by the UN General Assembly in November 1967. She believed that this declaration should be a prelude to the drafting and the adoption of by the United Nations of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which took place. It happened in 1979, although without her participation. Another woman here, Fryderyka Kalinowska. I would say this is one of my biggest discoveries in my book. Today she's completely forgotten, not only in the public debate, but also in the academia. And interestingly, she was one of 7 women from around the world who shortly after the war, after the Second World War, formed the United Nations Subcommission on the Status of Women. It was in 1946. And this subcommission preceded the Commission on the Status of Women, which was formed a few months later. Kalinowska's participation in meetings of the United Nations Third Committee on Social, Humanitarian and Cultural Affairs made a significant contribution to the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Unfortunately, Polish government at that time did not consider accepting the results of her and her colleagues' work. Poland did not sign the document. It did not veto it, but abstained from signing it. However, I think it's sad that in Poland we don't know this woman, we don't know the story, we don't know her contribution to drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And finally, another example, or last example I would like to mention, Wanda Tytzner. And I made an interview with Wanda Tytzner in 2018. It was a few months before her death. She died in February 2019. She was the editor-in-chief of Women of the Whole World, this magazine, which was the flagship magazine of the Women's International Democratic Federation. From my conversation with her, I learned that as part of the division of labor among WIDF women's organizations, Polish women were responsible for editing the magazine, which served as a link between women around the world in the pre-internet era. Tytzner mentioned the huge archive of letters that arrived at the Quarterly's East Berlin office at Unter den Linden 13. Women from all over the world wrote about what was happening in different regions of the world. They shared their fears and dreams. When Tytzner ended her term in 1977, she was succeeded by 2 other Polish journalists, Krystyna Niedzielska and Irena Karska, who led the magazine until 1990, a year before it ceased publication. And I just want to say that when I'm staying here, I realized that the Library of University of Michigan has the collection of maybe not all, but many issues of this magazine, which was first issued in 1951 and stopped being issuing in 1991. So it's an interesting reading, I would say, and the fact that Polish women were responsible for editorship of this magazine is also interesting and another unknown story. So these few examples show that in the second half of the 20th century, Polish so-called left feminists were very active internationally and not only on women's issues. And I would like to go to the conclusions. So what are the conclusions I would like to propose on the basis of my talk? First, it's necessary to conduct extensive research on the history of women and the women's movement in the People's Republic of Poland. Of course, such research is already underway, as you could see at the beginning of my presentation, but much remains to be done in this area. This is not only a matter of filling in the list of missing names and biographies, dates and achievements, but also an attempt to consider the period of state socialism as an integral part of Polish history and not just a specific slice of it without links to the earlier period and the present. Second, it is crucial to raise methodological questions, including the conceptualization of terms such as emancipation, empowerment, modernization, and agency. It's important to look at how different subjects of women's history, how different women thought about emancipation, how they understood their own agency. And finally, and this is not only my postulate, but especially that of the new studies of global history, including the global history of women and women's movements, is the need for research to go beyond the national context, to look at the activities of our protagonists, the organizations in which they were active, and the processes in which they participated in a broader inter- and transnational perspective. This provides an opportunity to move beyond the peculiar so-called methodological nationalism that characterizes much of the research on Polish history and which we increasingly need to uphold as researchers, but also as participants in the nation-oriented public debate. Research beyond methodological nationalism is already underway, of course. It is interesting and in a way sad, however, that many of the names of Polish leftist politicians, activists and intellectuals who fought for women's rights in the second half of the 20th century reach us in a roundabout way. That is, through the efforts of foreign scholars, but also Polish scholars working abroad. This is an interesting phenomenon. These scholars help us, Polish scholars working in Poland understand that Polish women actively participated in the creation of an ideologically committed vision of the post-war world, including the development of a leftist concept of social, political, and cultural order. I think that it's high time for Polish scholars working in Poland to open up to this field of research and to make our presence in this field more visible. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Agnieszka, for your talk. We have some time for questions. I just ask that you raise your hand and briefly state your name and affiliation. Alex?
I'm Alex Honorable from the Slavic department. Thank you very much for this very rich presentation and for the uncovering so many names who have been forgotten or denied by the history. My question is, it relates actually to the argument of your presentation, so boldly emphasized in the end, that these women are not sufficiently recognized or explored or researched. Could it be that, again, and all these women whom you have been talking about, they were somehow either boldly or not so much affiliated with the communist regime. They were also taking on roles. They were practically communist apparatchiks within the Ministry of Education. Babinska was a socialist writer. She wrote memoirs about her sweet meeting with Lenin and so on. So is it possible that this pushback is, especially currently in the post-Soviet period, related to the general attitude towards this dark communist socialist past of Poland, and as in relation to that, you emphasize that more research is done outside of Poland, as you know, and it is probably related because within Poland it is felt more, there is more sensitivity to those topics.
of course, and this is not only the problem of Poland, but other countries in the region, namely Central Eastern Europe. So this phenomenon which you kind of summarized is of course visible there as well. I think there are a few reasons, and I try to emphasize them at the beginning. So one thing is, of course, this anti-communist rationale, right? I mean, this anti-communist or anti-socialist, state socialist attitude of many researchers, right? Another thing is, as I said, gender blindness. This is like another thing, because interestingly, the activities of many men, politicians, officials, I'm not saying that they are discussed in a more favorable way, but still they are discussed more seriously. While women, and this is something which I did not mention in my talk, but now it's the time I can mention it, that these women whom I try to present in a, let's say, serious way as active in the public and political sphere, they are usually described as as women who are wives, lovers, daughters of famous, important men active in the party, for example. Like I did not mention Wanda Wasilewska, who is always presented as a daughter of her famous father, Leon Wasilewski. Zofia Dembińska, whom I also try to present in a, let's say, serious manner, is always emphasized either as a wife of her husband, Henryk Dembiński, who was murdered by the Nazis in 1941, or she's emphasized, she's portrayed as a right hand of Jerzy Boresia, who was the founder and the president of Czytelnik Publishing House. So she's presented as his right hand. And I could mention this that way, the many names that are presented this way. So one thing is, I agree, it's this anti-communist, anti-state socialist attitude of many researchers. Another thing is the gender blindness. However, I also wanted to say, I said it at the beginning, that many feminist scholars had for a long time a problem with seriously discussing this, I would say, different concept of women's activism or different concept of women's emancipation, because just after the transition, many feminist scholars, not only historians, also other scholars, also other activists, just neglected these efforts and say, well, this is a top-down emancipation. We cannot discuss it as a serious example of, I don't know, emancipatory politics done for women seriously. So they, I would say, neglected these efforts. However, in the last, as I said, 15 years, yes, you are right, and I am right, that it's mostly scholars working abroad who kind of work on this topic and use different approach to the topic, but also some scholars working in Poland try to discuss this topic and this women in a different way, not only in the, let's say, not only using this totalitarianist approach, but also paying more attention on the issues of modernization, progress, social activism that was defined differently at the time than it is defined right now. And thanks to my colleagues who did this great work, like Agata Zysiak, a sociologist who did an incredible work on the higher education system in post-war Poland, I could build on this, and say and write that these women were not only involved in one sector or in another, they worked in different sectors, and women's emancipation was only one of the matters they dealt with, right? So yes, you are right. I don't know.
Brian Porter-Such, History Department. I think I'd like to come at this from, I think, the opposite direction. Okay. As I was listening to your talk today, I think your broader point about bringing these women's stories and the whole issue of women's emancipation towards the center of our understanding of the communist era, it might allow us to think differently. And I don't know, I'm just thinking of this right now, about the relationship between anti-feminism and anti-communism. It is quite common, of course, and during the anti-feminist backlash of the 90s particularly, it was very common to say, oh, well, that's just because feminism got wrapped up in communism. And that's why there was so much anti-feminism. Might it be that anti-communism was so intense, particularly among the intelligentsia, the male intelligentsia, because it was linked to feminism, because there is this genuine emancipatory move, particularly in the Stalinist era, that maybe is part of not that which is explained by anti-communism, but rather the other way around.
Yes, I agree. I agree. It's there. And I read and I analyzed in my book, I'm not sure if it's going to be also in the English edition, but in the Polish edition, I analyzed the memoirs, the autobiographical accounts of men from intelligentsia, these anti-communist oppositionists, who definitely had a problem with this very active women during the state socialism. And they say, well, you know, Stalinism, but also later, it was all marked by like hyperactivity of these women who were who can be associated with Stalinist politics, and the new period just started with de-Stalinization, when young, fresh, you know, anti-communist women appeared on the scene, on the stage, and you know, then everything could happen and could start again. So yes. So the memoirs of Polish intelligentsia men. Active in the anti-communist anti-communist opposition movements. Well, it's a great reading, I would say, an interesting reading, and well, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Oh, how much time is allowed for questions?
Yeah, we'll have a couple.
Okay, 3 men
Jack,
have been
and then you're next.
allowed to speak.
Okay, go ahead.
You've very briefly alluded to this perception of the communist era in Poland as like a historical stopgap. And I do get that impression when I talk to people who like lived through it, that it, or are in the American diaspora, that it was this kind of like weird stasis period where like nothing was going on and society just like didn't change at all, and then it magically became a country again in the late 80s and early 90s. And I'm wondering, one, what you think the psychology behind that might be, or you know, if you have any potential causative explanations for that kind of denialism, and two, if that's something you think is visible in other Warsaw Pact countries, or if that's something that we really see mostly in Poland. Because I don't ever really hear people talk about Hungary or Czechoslovakia or these other regions that way, like there was this period of time that just doesn't count, basically.
Yeah. So in Czechoslovakia, in Czech Republic, I think it's very strong as well. Namely, but my research is mostly referring to the feminist scholarship, feminist historiography. So in Poland, but also as far as I know, in Czech Republic, there is this argument saying that there was plenty of women's feminist activists before the war, in the interwar period. Then it stopped because it did not count as a feminist activism. And then everything starts right after 1989, when a new generation, and it's the concept of generation I discussed a lot in my book, how the concept of generation is used in this counting the history, you know, anew, how it is important and valid. So many feminist activists, both in Poland and Czech Republic, they said that, well, after 1989, everything started again. I don't have an explanation. I don't have like any psychological explanation for that. I think that the issue of generation is one of the concept of generation is one of the of concepts that could be used to explain this. I mean, for many women who became active just after the transition period, this was their life. They were new. They were in the 20s. They're in their 30s. They were, you know, starting all these NGOs, all these women's organizations. It was just a fresh beginning. They did not want to, you know, talk to these older women who are usually their mothers and grandmothers who were active in a state socialist period. They said, well, they were this, they were so dependent on the party, on their male party comrades, that this was such a top-down emancipation that we don't want to have anything in common. And then, we have this fresh new start, which is also very much connected with the reconceptualization of Polish relations with the West, this returning to the Polish, to the European or Western home, right? So we are there, Polish women, Polish activists, Polish feminists, and they don't want to have anything in common with what happened. So I think that in Czech Republic it's still very strong as well. I don't know how it is in Hungary, for example, but in Bulgaria it's not that strong as far as I know. And the research also coming from Bulgaria, I would say quite advanced in discussing the Bulgarian women's movement. Yeah.
I just want to thank you and say that it was an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
And I think your research should be done in every country, no matter what the political power is at the top. And I wanted to ask you, is this kind of research being done in other countries?
Yes, definitely. Yes, it is. It is done. As I said, in Bulgaria, it's quite advanced.
No, not just former communist countries.
But which kind of research on women's active in communist movements?
No, women active in any kind of political movement.
Yes, I think that they are quite a lot of.
See,
yeah.
I don't think it's done here in the U.S.
I don't know.
But thank you.
Yeah,
That's my opinion.
I will stay with this question.
I'm older than most people here.
Thank you. I will stay with this question. Yeah.
Hi, Benjamin Paloff from Slavic and Complit. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the role of Polish studies abroad, outside of Poland, which I agree has had enormous benefits for the study of Polish specific issues in Poland and has pressured discourse in Poland in very interesting and productive ways. I kind of want to speak to, or ask you to speak to, the damage it has done, particularly how during the communist period, the cultural canon of what constitutes Poland and Polishness, in terms of important figures, major writers, etc., generally was shaped by individuals who brought their own personal chauvinism with them when they came to the United States. So that if you read Miłosz's The History of Polish Literature, which is still the standard textbook, even though there are alternatives now, but it still is dominant. Miłosz's own personal taste consistently discounts the value of women as cultural movers of any kind.
Yeah.
And where it comes off like really strange is, you take a major early pre-communist 20th century feminist figure like Zofia Dembińska, she effectively disappears from the canon of Polish literature.
That's true.
And appears only as what I refer to as a footnote to the sexual life of Bruno Schulz, even though in their lifetimes, Schulz was a very, very minor writer, and Naukowska was a giant.
Yeah.
And because of that, Naukowska has only been translated into English significantly in the last few years.
That's true.
So I'm wondering if you could speak to, frankly, the damage that the Polish studies abroad has done, and where we could do better to correct the sins of our fathers.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think, discussing, for example, Miłosz, yes, I agree. He did a lot of damage to presenting women that way. And also communist women, for example, Zofia Dembińska, whom I mentioned, is by him described as a wife of Henryk Dębiński and the right hand of Jerzy Borejsza. So he did it. To these women as well. What we can do about it? Well, when I said that many, let's say, more progressive ideas are coming from the West or are developed in the West or abroad, let's say, about the topic that I am interested in, I just thought about, new research perspectives, new tools that can be applied to discuss this, which are not that boldly used in Poland, or at least they were not that boldly used in Poland in the last few years, also because of the political situation, but probably other things. But but I did not. It's a good question. I did not think about people like Miłosz, who did all this. So that's something I have to think about more. That's a good point. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for an amazing talk. I've learned so much.
Thank you.
I will say that all of this is also happening in Hungary. You can't talk about this period. Even you can't write about economic history between 1945 and 1989.
Yeah.
Not even economic history.
Okay.
It's like it doesn't count. And then, you know, women's involvement.
Yeah.
Yeah. My question though is about some of these, and I don't know how to put this, but you talked about the Stalinist period as being, as was everywhere, the period of greatest social mobility, and also mobility for women. At the same time, there was under Stalinism this counter-conservatism,
of course,
family kind of conservatism. And then there seems to be a class dimension where the kinds of jobs you were talking about were very masculine coded, steel workers, tractor drivers, this stereotype. And then in the 70s, when social mobility, it seems like the mobility for women class-wise into professional, is that right? So women then move, like your example of the doctor.
The nurses, doctors,
so is there like
officials.
A sense that in the 50s and 60s there was more social mobility among working classes, and that in the 70s and 80s for women it was middle?
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I mean, my protagonists, that's interesting. They were many of them were from the intelligentsia. These women who did all this, they were from the interwar, pre-war intelligentsia. But even before the war, they were very active in promoting the rights of working class women, peasant women. However, in that conditions, in that political situation, it was difficult to move forward with this slogan. So when the war ended and the new political atmosphere appeared, they, of course, it was part of the party, let's say, line. They put a lot of effort in promoting the education, but also work, or the activism of women from the working class or peasantry. This was lot of effort, and this is brilliantly described by Agata Zysiak, how a lot of institutional tools were used to promote, to allow men and women from working class peasantry to enter not only higher but first secondary education. Also for women, yes, this was called that women are entering the sphere of, let's say, new professions, which were formerly called male professions, but now it was this degendering of the field of the labor. But just after Stalinism ended, just on the wave of the thaw or de-Stalinization, the visible changes were introduced, and women were discouraged from entering engineering studies or choosing these technical fields. Just like working class and peasant youth were discouraged, or there were no tools that allowed them to be enrolled in the higher education. So I would say that this conservative trend, even though it was conservative under Stalinism, is even more conservative in the later period. And in the 60s and 70s, yes, my women turn again to the intelligentsia, their intelligentsia background, and they started to promote. If we follow these productions, the film productions, if we read their novels, we read their short stories, and the advices they gave to the youth, for example, or women, and the magazines, on the pages of the magazines, we will see that the new ideal of a womanhood is a woman from the city, from intelligentsia, choosing her work in the administration and as a doctor, as a nurse, So this is like the feminization plus this return to intelligentsia mode of activism. Yes, it is something that I'm also describing in my book, and I could not raise it here for obvious reasons. Yeah, but thank you. Yeah.
Excellent.
Thank you.
My question is, during the Second World War, there was a group of Polish refugees that came to Iran.
Yeah.
And they stayed and they settled and so forth. And my question is there any connection between the Polish women outside Iran and the Polish women that stayed in Iran? Number one. And number two, the woman life freedom movement that started in Iran, is there any connection between the women movements in Poland to that?
Okay, so for the first question, you mean this refugees who came to Iran with General Anders? You mean this? This? So yes. So by my activists, my protagonists of my research, these were not the movements they would like to associate them with because of the political reasons. However, Zofia Dembińska, I can go back. Interestingly, Zofia Dembińska, this lady here, her brother, this is not a woman, but her brother was in the Anders army. And it's interesting because in one of the stories, it's a fictional story, but it is based on her life and her brother's life. She is ashamed. She says, I'm ashamed of him because he is representing this other army. This is not our army, but this is because of the political reasons. In the real life, they were in a good relations. But about women, I don't know if there were any connections. This is something, in fact, that I'm working on right now. I'm working on how Polish women were also more involved in the international arena, also active in the so-called global South countries, and how they told the stories about women in those countries, and how what they told to Polish audience about what was happening outside Poland. So this is my new project. Thank you for this. And about Iran, this woman with whom I spoke before she died, Wanda Żółkiewska, this editor-in-chief of the Women of the Whole World, she said that she collaborated in the editorship, in the editorial office of this magazine with Iranian women as well, and with Iraqi women as well, because they were also narrating about the lives of women in the country. So these stories can also be found on the pages of this magazine. And I was just looking through the magazine yesterday, and I think that there are many accounts or many information on the pages of this magazine, which was, by the way, issued in 6 languages, and Arabic was one of the languages in which it was issued. So, thank you. Yeah.
My name is Lily. I'm just a student here. So I was wondering, a big part of this presentation or this lecture was on the superstructure and the advertisement of the policies, and I was just wondering how outside technology reasons, how that might have shifted between the eras between Stalin and Khrushchev and Gorbachev, and how maybe one era might have been more effective than the other, and how general working class interpreted the superstructure.
Well, that's another good question, big topic. I think that what I'm doing in my research is to examine, as you could see, the activism of these women who made all this happen. So I'm interested in how these women also evolved with their, with their views, with their political tools that they could use and adopt to the new conditions. So in fact, in my book, I trace their activism starting from the interwar period, then we have post-war period with Stalinism, right, and after Stalinism. So this was a kind of interesting discovery for me to see that my women, my activism did not stop their activism when Stalinism ended. They were still active in the 60s, 70s, some even in 80s. Many of them died in the 80s, but that's interesting that before they died, they produced their memoirs or autobiographical accounts. And I'm not saying maybe no one, but very few people read this this text before me and analyze them in a, let's say, in a serious manner to see, you know, how these women, not only what these women write about, but also how they did it. You know, what literary tools, for example, what literary conventions they used to present activism. So I'm very much interested in seeing that, you know, this hard Stalinists, you know, who are so active just after the war, they also, you know, in the 70s or 60s, they write these novels for girls or the sex guides for young people. That's very interesting. And they use completely different language, even though still emancipatory, but different, you know, and they do not give up. That's interesting, yeah? Yeah?
One last question.
Yeah?
Could we say that paradoxically, the Polish early feminists that you were discussing, by associating themselves so closely with communism, which we also need to remember that it's not just communism, it's also Russia, which, you know, for these people then, as well as for many people still now, communism meant not just ideology, but a continuation of partitions, a 1920 threat. All of these things were really the, you know, the occupation of Poland, almost de facto, by the Russians. So that by associating themselves with communism, read as the foreign power, instead of helping the cause of feminism, they hurt it. Because it just disappeared from the map. So while the women were enjoying real life benefits, like access to professions, more rights, emancipation, all of these things, feminism was almost non-existent. I remember myself when I was working for Solidarity in 1980-81, when foreign journalists and scholars would come to the union and ask us about feminism. It seemed, the question itself seemed frilly. We had a sense of fighting for bigger things like independence and all of that. So paradoxically, feminism really came to Poland as a visible, not women's rights movement, not emancipation, but feminism came much later than it could have come if not for that unfortunate association.
Well, that's a very good point, and I did not discuss it in my talk. I cut it from the presentation, the issue of terminology. So my women, my protagonists, would never call themselves feminists because they thought, following the October revolutionaries, you know, like Nadjeżda Krupska, Inessa Armand, Aleksandra Kollontaj, that feminism was a movement of bourgeois women, right? And they themselves wanted to work for women from the subordinated classes, like working class, peasantry. So they would never call themselves feminists. However, in the new line of research, which is now conducted, there is this, one of the, let's say, propositions is to call these women left feminists, like leftist feminists, right? So to emphasize their involvement in women's rights, but also very much connected with the activism for the right of working class people and peasantry, right? So I use this term left feminism in my book to call them that way, my women. However, I make this note that for them it could be problematic. So here, of course, we face the issue of, you know, how we treat the protagonists of the history we are telling about. You know, if we are respecting their, you know, their wishes and the way they wanted to be called, or maybe we are like using different tools and try to explain with different tools, you know, what they were doing. But yes, you are absolutely right in terms of terminology. They would not call themselves feminism, and feminism was still connected with the bourgeois, interwar, or even 19th century movement, and they wanted to avoid it. So they rather used the term pro-women activism or women's activism. That's why Women's League was the mass women's organization and not mass feminist organization, right?
Super interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.